Hey guys, welcome to Chinese History Stories. Tonight we're starting a journey that begins with silence. Not just any silence, but a silence carved in stone. Imagine you're standing in the shadow of a massive stele, taller than a two-story house, weathered by 1,000 years of wind and time. But unlike every other imperial tomb in Chinese history, this one is blank. No golden praise, no elegant calligraphy, not even the name of the person buried there. Just stone. Cold, quiet, and completely, stubbornly empty. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And hey, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop your city and the current time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The woman beneath that stele is no ordinary figure. She was the only female emperor in Chinese history. Not a queen, not a consort, an emperor. Her name was Wu Zetian, and her reign was both magnificent and controversial. But perhaps the most puzzling thing she ever did was to leave that stone blank. No emperor before her, and none after, dares such a move. Historians have scratched their heads for centuries. What kind of person climbs to the top of the world and then chooses not to write her own name in the sky? Let's rewind. The year is 705 CE. Wu Zetian has just died at the age of 81 after ruling China in various capacities for over half a century. She is to be buried in Qianling Mausoleum, a grand tomb she built alongside her beloved husband, Emperor Gaozong of Tan. It's a stunning sight, carved into the side of a mountain, flanked by giant statues and intricate reliefs. But the centerpiece, the thing you can't miss, is the stele. That massive slab, standing tall at the front, reserved for the emperor's life achievements, meant to immortalize greatness for all eternity. But this one has no words. According to some accounts, it wasn't an accident. Wu Zetian herself gave the order. She wanted her life to be judged by future generations, not by a stone set in her time. It's a poetic idea, leaving the page blank, letting others write their own version. But it also smells like a trap, doesn't it? See, Wu Zetian wasn't exactly the type to let go of control. She was a master of narrative, brilliant at using stories and symbols to build her power. She renamed the dynasty. She rewrote Confucian texts. She even created new Chinese characters to reflect her reign. This was a woman who didn't just play the game, she rewrote the rulebook. So why, at the very end, does she hand the pen to someone else? Maybe it was strategic. By leaving the stele blank, she guaranteed that people would talk about her forever. Maybe she knew the power of mystery. That silence invites noise. That a blank page demands interpretation. And in doing so, she ensured that no single version of her story would ever dominate. Instead, her legacy became a living debate reshaped by every generation that looked upon that stone and asked, who was she, really? And yet, some scholars argue it wasn't her choice at all. They say it was her son, Emperor Gaozong, who left the stone blank, that he didn't know how to frame her legacy, or perhaps didn't dare try. Others believe it was an internal power struggle, or even simple procrastination that froze the chisel. But no matter the reason, the result is the same, a monument of silence, echoing louder than any inscription. Tonight, we'll try to fill in some of that silence. We'll walk through Wu Zetian's life from her early days as a concubine, to the heights of imperial power, to the decisions that made her both revered and feared. And maybe, just maybe, we'll understand why the most powerful woman in Chinese history chose to leave her final words unsaid. The irony is harder to ignore. Wu Zetian, the woman who ruled through language, who bent public opinion like soft clay, chose or accepted a blank stele. This silence wasn't just curious, it was out of character. Because if there was one thing Wu Zetian mastered in her lifetime, it was the written word. She knew how to shape truth. Her entire career, from palace maid to Empress of China, was built not just on strategy and ruthlessness, but on how effectively she told her story, and more importantly, how she silenced others. She didn't just fight with swords or armies, she fought with scrolls, petitions, edicts. Words were her sharpest weapon. She knew how to accuse with precision, how to flatter with subtlety, how to edit her image. And at a time when the Confucian elite were all but allergic to the idea of a woman in power, Wu Zetian didn't just survive, she thrived by hijacking their own language and turning it against them. You see, Wu Zetian rose in a culture where women were supposed to be silent and obedient. That was the Confucian ideal. But she flipped the script. She began with small, symbolic shifts, having her name appear more prominently in palace records, issuing edicts directly, and eventually commanding state rituals. And then she started making moves that were anything but subtle. She edited Confucian texts, putting a spin on heavenly mandate, so that gender no longer disqualified someone from ruling. She planted stories about prophecies, celestial omens, and divine approval. One inscription from her era claimed she was born from purple light, yes, literal divine energy. Another tale said a talking stone lion outside her house shouted, "Long live the Empress!" And sure, it sounds dramatic now, but back then symbolism was everything. These stories helped people accept the impossible. A woman on the dragon throne. She even introduced new Chinese characters to reflect her vision. One famous example was the character she chose for her own name, Ji, pronounced Zhao, a character she invented herself. It combined the elements for sun and moon above the word sky, suggesting she ruled everything under heaven. Subtle? Not at all. Powerful? Absolutely. And yet, for someone who understood the power of writing better than anyone, her own legacy becomes this peculiar vacuum. Some say this is the ultimate confidence move. After all, isn't silence the loudest message when everyone expects a speech? Maybe Wu Zetian was saying, I don't need to defend myself. My story tells itself. Or maybe, just maybe, she knew that no words could truly capture her complexity. Because she wasn't simply a hero or a villain, she was a paradox. She promoted capable officials regardless of class or gender, but also executed thousands in political purges. She strengthened the state and protected peasants, but she also trusted secret police and informants. She empowered Buddhism while simultaneously weakening Confucian influence. Every gain came with a cost. Every bold stroke, a shadow. This is why that blank stele nags at us. It's like an unfinished sentence from someone who never left anything unfinished. Or maybe she knew that no inscription could avoid being politicized. Praise her too much? It would be erased by the next dynasty. Criticize her? Same thing. Leave it blank? Suddenly, it can't be weaponized. It becomes a mirror. You see what you bring. She controlled so much in life. The blank stele may be the only thing she couldn't or wouldn't control, or perhaps it was one last manipulation. Because centuries later, here we are, still talking about it. Still asking questions, still falling into the puzzle she left behind. And isn't that exactly what a master of narrative would want? Before she became the legend sealed behind the silent stele, Wu Zetian was just a name on a roster, a teenage girl selected to serve in Emperor Taizong's palace. No one expected much. After all, she wasn't born into royalty. Her family was wealthy, yes, but they were merchants turned officials, not quite noble, not quite common. Just enough status to get her foot in the door, not enough to keep her there. At 14, she entered the palace as a low-ranking concubine. The Tang Dynasty's inner court was like a gilded cage, filled with silent battles, political maneuvering, wrapped in silk and tea ceremonies. And Wu, she was a background. The emperor barely noticed her. For years, she blended into the palace walls, observing, learning, waiting, but then fate, shaped like grief, nudged history forward. When Emperor Taizong died, Wu was supposed to join a Buddhist nunnery. That was standard practice. Concubines who didn't bear sons were often sent to temples, their lives fading quietly into prayer and incense. And for a while, that's exactly where she went. Shaved head, monastic silence, gone from the palace stage. But Wu wasn't done. She had met someone before the old emperor passed his son, the future emperor Gaozong. Their connection had sparked while she was still in the palace, subtle and forbidden. After his father's death, Emperor Gaozong did something unprecedented. He brought Wu back from the convent and installed her in his own harem. In the rigid moral universe of the time, this was a scandal. Sleeping with your father's concubine? That was not just taboo, it was a cosmic no-no. Yet somehow, Wu turned this into advantage. While the Empress and higher-ranking concubines bickered over etiquette and legitimacy, Wu Zetian focused on proximity to power. She used her calm presence, her intelligence, her ability to read a room and a man's mind. Gaozong was not a strong emperor. He was often sick, indecisive, dependent. Wu filled the gaps, gradually becoming his most trusted partner, not just in bed, but in governance. And then came her most chilling political move. She gave birth to a daughter, not long after the baby died. Mysteriously, suspiciously, Wu claimed that the reigning Empress Wang had murdered the child out of jealousy. The court was horrified. The scandal rippled through the harem and beyond. No one could prove anything, but the emperor believed Wu, or maybe he simply needed to. Empress Wang was deposed. Wu took her place, just like that. From nunnery to empress in a few calculated steps. And while many whispered that she had orchestrated the baby's death herself, Wu never flinched. Her face said grief. Her mind said checkmate. Once empress, she tightened her grip on power. Slowly, steadily, she edged out rival families, installed loyal officials, and positioned herself not just as consort, but as co-ruler. Gaozong's declining health worked in her favor. As he faded, she stepped forward, attending audiences, signing decrees, deciding policy. This wasn't just ambition. This was survival. In the Tang court, power was oxygen, and women, even empresses, could suffocate quickly if they didn't stay useful, feared, or admired. Wu managed all three. She cultivated scholars, patronized Buddhism, and promised the people stability. But behind the curtain, she was ruthless. She used spies. She crushed dissent. She did what male rulers did, only better, because she had to. There was no safety net for a woman at the top. By the time Gaozong died, no one was surprised that Wu Zetian didn't step back. Instead, she became Empress Dowager and ruled through her sons as regents. But anyone paying attention knew this wasn't regency. It was rehearsal. She was preparing for something no woman in Chinese history had ever done before. Take the throne, not beside a man, not behind one, alone. And it all started with that quiet girl in a palace room no one visited. The one who watched, waited, and when the time came, rewrote the ending. When Wu Zetian finally stepped into the center of the dragon throne, not as a regent, not as a placeholder, but as the official son of heaven, it sent shockwaves through the empire. This wasn't a power grab in the shadows anymore. This was a public, deliberate coronation. She didn't just sit on the throne. She dismantled the very system that had always said she couldn't. In 690 CE, she declared a brand new dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, interrupting the Tang for 15 bold years, and gave herself the title of Huangdi, not Empress, Emperor. Imagine the logistics, the audacity. Court robes were redesigned. Imperial rituals were rewritten. Officials had to refer to her using masculine titles, which created all sorts of awkward grammatical gymnastics in memorials. But she didn't flinch because Wu understood something few rulers did. Symbols shape reality. If people see you as the emperor long enough, you are the emperor. Her reign wasn't just about making statements. It was about building an empire that functioned more efficiently in some ways than the men before her. She restructured the civil service exam system, expanding it to allow more lower-class citizens, especially those without noble family ties, to climb into government. She promoted talent over bloodlines. She gave power to those who could prove themselves, not just those born lucky. For a while, the government actually ran smoother under her. But she didn't rule with soft hands. She had learned early on that mercy without control meant chaos. So she built a terrifying system of surveillance, secret police, informants, and anonymous accusation boxes in temples. Her enemies vanished, sometimes literally. Political purges happened not just to protect her, but to remind everyone, don't test the Empress. It's easy to label her as brutal, and yes, she was. But then again, so were the male emperors before her. The difference? When they killed for power, it was politics. When she did it, it was scandal. The double standard was real. And Wu knew it. So she stopped trying to play fair. She played to win. And yet, she wasn't just a cold strategist. She was also weirdly poetic. She wrote verses, patronized Buddhist art, and filled the empire with temples and grand architecture. The Longmen Grottos? Yeah, she helped sponsor that. She saw herself as both emperor and divine messenger, carefully tying her image to Buddhist prophecy. Some believed she was the reincarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha, and she didn't discourage that rumor. This blend of spiritual grandeur and political steel made her unlike any ruler before her. She wasn't just running the state, she was reshaping the very narrative of what power could look like. A woman was no longer just a background figure in history. She was history. Her face was on official portraits. Her name was in the annals. Her will moved armies, laws, calendars, everything. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. The Confucian elite were quietly fuming. To them, Wu's reign was an abomination. Women were supposed to manage the household, not the cosmos. But what could they do? She had the military, the bureaucrats, the palace, and surprisingly, a large portion of the common people, because for all the blood spilled in court, life for regular folks wasn't bad under Wu. Stability returned. Reforms benefited farmers. The border was relatively peaceful. Roads and canals were maintained. Bread and circuses, yes, but also genuine reforms. Still, time catches up with everyone. By the time she was in her 70s, her health declined. She began to lose her grip. Paranoia set in. She trusted fewer people. Her once sharp instincts dulled, and around her, ambitious courtiers began sharpening their knives. But that part comes later. For now, picture her at the height of power. A woman who broke through every ceiling, rewrote every rule, and stood alone in the Forbidden City as the empire bowed. She didn't ask to be remembered. She made it impossible to forget her. By the time Wu Zetian had ruled for decades, her name was everywhere, etched into official edicts, spoken in palace rituals, whispered in tea shops, feared in court hallways. And yet, when she finally left this world, she left behind no words of her own. Not on the tombstone, at least. And maybe that was because she knew, deep down, that no matter what she wrote, others would write over it. Because history, especially when written by those who survive you, has a funny way of twisting things. Let's talk about legacy. Wu Zetian's reign ended in 705 CE. By then, she was in her 80s, frail, and increasingly controlled by favorites and palace factions. Her final years were messy, and her death was followed by a quick political reversal. Her son, Gaozong, once removed by her, now returned to the throne and immediately restored the Tang dynasty, erasing her Zhou reign from official narratives like it had been a typo in the timeline. And that's when the smear campaign began. The Confucian historians, many of whom had waited patiently in the shadows, finally had their revenge. They called her cruel, tyrannical, immoral. They accused her of murdering her children, of seducing her way to power, of being driven by lust and greed. The records began to drip with venom. Even her love life became a political weapon, mentioning her younger male favorites, painting her as a depraved old woman who had lost her dignity. But was she really worse than the emperors who came before her? Let's be honest. The Tang Dynasty was no stranger to palace intrigue, assassinations, or scandalous affairs. Male rulers had concubines by the dozens, waged bloody purges, and indulged in luxuries while the people starved. Wu did much of the same, but she was a woman. That changed everything. Her power didn't just challenge individual men. It threatened entire worldview. So, the pens of history came down hard. And yet, strangely, even with all the dirt thrown at her, Wu Zetian refused to disappear. Her legend grew. For every scholar who dismissed her as a villain, another saw her as a genius. For every accusation of cruelty, there was a record of reforms. For every whispered scandal, there was undeniable evidence of her competence. It's as if she became a kind of historical inkblot. What people saw in her said more about themselves than about her. To feminists centuries later, she became a symbol of female ambition and strength. To critics of authoritarianism, she was a warning. To the curious, a puzzle. And in a way, the blank stele makes perfect sense in this context. Because how do you summarize a life like that in a few carved characters? If her epitaph had praised her, it would have been erased. If it condemned her, it would have been rewritten. But silence? Silence can't be edited. It becomes a vacuum that sucks. In curiosity, speculation, even admiration, it resists closure. And maybe, just maybe, she preferred it that way. There's also this. By refusing to define herself on that stone, she forced future generations to talk about her, to argue, to debate, to remember. She handed over the pen not to her son or to the court historians, but to all of us. We became the scribes, the judges, the narrators of her story, and every generation has written her a little differently. So what is her legacy? Is she the power-hungry villain who murdered her way to the top, or the capable ruler who brought stability and reform to a chaotic empire, or both? What we know for sure is that she changed the game, and maybe that's the most honest epitaph of all. She made us rewrite the rules. Now imagine standing in front of that colossal stele again, the one at Qianling, the one that says nothing. It's weathered, cracked in places, moss climbing up its base, but still upright after more than 1,000 years. The birds fly overhead. The mountain wind whispers through the grass. And you're left wondering, is this emptiness actually the loudest thing she ever said? Because sometimes no inscription is the inscription. Let's think about it. Wu Zetian, the emperor who invented her own Chinese character, who rebranded dynasties, reshaped ideologies, and mastered state propaganda, didn't leave behind a single official word summing up her reign. That wasn't forgetfulness. It was deliberate. And not in a dramatic drop the mic kind of way, but in a more subtle, perhaps even philosophical gesture. See, in Chinese culture, the concept of bai, leaving blank space, is a powerful one. Artists do it in brush painting, poets in verse, musicians in silence. It's not laziness. It's a kind of elegance. You let the space breathe. You let the viewer feel. You allow for interpretation. Wu Zetian, consciously or not, turned her tomb into a national-scale piece of abstract art. And if you think that's a stretch, well, let's remember she was obsessed with image, but not in a shallow way. She understood the emotional architecture of power, how memory works, how symbols linger longer than facts. She likely knew that no matter how eloquently she tried to sum up her life, her words would be distorted by the dynasties that came after her. In fact, she had already witnessed how quickly narratives could shift. Her own rise was paved by twisting stories, editing history, and claiming divine legitimacy through carefully timed omens. She played the narrative game better than anyone. So in her final act, maybe she chose to leave the game board entirely. Or maybe she was saying something even more subversive, that no one, not even an emperor, gets to define their legacy. That power, however grand, is still just a chapter in someone else's story. That even she, Wu Zetian, Empress of Heaven, could not carve her truth into eternity. So instead of writing one version and watching it be destroyed or rewritten, she left the canvas untouched and dared the world to do what it always does, fill in the blanks. And look at us, still filling them in. We speculate, debate, project. Some call her a proto-feminist icon, others a tyrant in a dress. Some see a dragon cloaked in silk. Others a survivor who climbed because she had no other choice. The stele doesn't correct us. It just stands there, quietly multiplying questions. And here's the twist. That silence might be the most honest thing about her whole reign. Because Wu Zetian lived in contradictions, she was both the mother and the executioner, the reformer and the despot, the Buddhist patron and the political schemer. No sentence could hold all of that. No poetic flourish could balance the blood and the beauty. So instead of leaving a summary, she left a mirror. And every generation that looks into it ends up writing more about themselves than about her. Do we admire her? That says something. Do we condemn her? That says something too. Are we uncomfortable with her? Intrigued? Inspired? She anticipated all of it. She set the trap. And we're still stepping into it, century after century, never quite sure if she's smirking somewhere, watching us argue about her blank stone. Which makes you wonder, maybe she didn't want her name carved in rock because she already carved it into time? Let's stay a little longer at Qianling, Wu Zetian's final resting place. This isn't your average imperial tomb. It's a mountain, literally. Qianling is built into the north peak of Mount Liang, a commanding presence overlooking the plains of Shaanxi. And everything about it, its location, layout, even the silence in its stone feels intentional. If the stele was a riddle, then the entire tomb complex is the rest of the puzzle. First, the setting. Qianling doesn't just sit on the mountain, it is the mountain. Unlike many imperial tombs dug into artificial mounds or valley grounds, Wu Zetian and her husband, Emperor Gaozong, were buried inside a natural peak. That's not just dramatic, it's symbolic. It's permanence. You can knock down a monument, you can desecrate a statue, but you can't destroy a mountain. She made sure of that. The path up is lined with stone figures, guards, horses, lions, and the foreign envoys. Yes, foreign envoys. Statues of ambassadors from faraway lands stand facing the tomb, frozen mid-bow, as if paying eternal tribute. It's one of the earliest signs of China's international clout. And it also says something about Wu Zetian's self-image. She wasn't just the ruler of a kingdom, she saw herself as center stage in the world's grand play. But let's get to the weird part. Qianling was never fully excavated. It's still sealed. Unlike many other royal tombs that have been opened, looted, restored, and turned into museum pieces, Wu Zetian's remains lie untouched beneath layers of mountain and mystery. Some say it's because the underground structure is too vast or the geology too risky. Others claim it's out of respect or fear. After all, disturbing the resting place of such a controversial figure carries weight. And then there's a more poetic theory, that no one has the right to open her tomb because no one ever truly understood her. Even without opening it though, Qianling whispers secrets. Satellite scans and ancient records hint at elaborate chambers inside frescoes, treasures, possibly texts. But no one knows for sure, which again fits perfectly with the theme of her life. Always half-lit, never fully known. And here's another detail. Wu Zetian and Gaozong are buried together. Yes, side by side. The woman who overthrew dynastic traditions, created her own dynasty, and ruled as emperor, chose to be buried with the man who first brought her into the palace. Her partner, her co-ruler, her once sickly husband, who faded as she rose. What does that say? Some historians see it as a sentimental gesture. Others say it was politically practical, tying herself back to the Tang lineage to avoid posthumous erasure. Maybe it was both. Maybe it was the one thing she couldn't untangle. Love and strategy. After all, power and emotion were never truly separate in her world. Then there is the architecture itself. The tomb isn't just symmetrical and grand, it's defensive. Hidden, built to last. Some researchers believe it contains traps to prevent grave robbers. Others suspect documents, maybe even records written in her own hand, were buried with her to one day tell her side of the story when the world was ready. But here's the cruel twist of imperial burial. Once you're inside, you're voiceless. No matter how much power you held in life, the afterlife levels everything. And the for Wu Zetian, who had controlled narratives with surgical precision, that must have felt risky, maybe even unbearable. So she preempted it with the blank stele, the unexcavated tomb, and layers upon layers of symbolic defense. She didn't just build a burial site, she built a fortress of legacy. And yet, we still stand outside, peering in, hoping one day the mountain might open up and reveal the missing chapter. But even if it doesn't, even if it never does, she wins. Because that wanting to know, that itch to understand her, is exactly the spell she cast. One that hasn't worn off in over 1,000 years. By now, it's hard to ignore the feeling that Wu Zetian was playing a much longer game than anyone around her realized. Not just a political game, or even a dynastic one, but something stranger, something more existential. Like she knew her reign was only the beginning of the conversation. Like she wanted to be a question, not an answer. And maybe that's the whole point of the blank stele. It's not just a personal silence, it's a challenge to all of us. A kind of intellectual cliffhanger. What will you choose to remember me as? Because legacy isn't about what actually happened, it's about what survives. And Wu Zetian understood that better than any emperor before or after her. She had seen too many names rewritten, too many deeds distorted, too many truths reshaped to fit whoever was holding the pen. So instead of trying to control her image forever, maybe she decided to turn the mirror around, force us to reflect on ourselves. What do you see when you think of a woman in absolute power? Do you instinctively search for flaws? Are you more comfortable when she's labeled a villain? Or does part of you want her to be a hero? The answer probably says more about you than it does about her. And the crazy thing, she knew that. She knew that by leaving no inscription, she would become the most interpreted, debated, mythologized ruler in Chinese history. One chapter says she killed her own daughter. Another says she was framed. One historian praises her reforms. Another condemns her cruelty. But the stele doesn't argue, it just waits. And here's where things get really meta. Scholars have proposed dozens of possible interpretations of the blank stele. Some say it's humility, others say it's arrogance. Some even say it reflects Buddhist detachment from ego and self. The truth is, it's probably all of that and none of it. Because silence, unlike words, doesn't limit itself. And in that silence, we've written entire libraries. Wu Zetian has become a Rorschach test across generations. In the Tang, she was an anomaly. In later dynasties, she was a cautionary tale. In modern China, she's often reimagined as a proto-feminist or a symbol of meritocracy. In global pop culture, a mix of Cleopatra and House of Cards. Every era picks the version that makes the most sense to them, and she lets them, because she built the perfect machine, a legacy that regenerates itself. The less she says, the more we speak, the more we try to summarize her, the less certain we become. And somewhere in that swirl of contradiction, she stays immortal. Not because she was flawless, but because she was complicated and she let herself remain that way. And isn't that the rarest thing of all in history? Most rulers get flattened into caricatures. The tyrant, the saint, the fool, the genius. But Wu Zetian refused that. She gave us silence, and in doing so, she forced us to wrestle with complexity. She didn't want to be the final word. She wanted to be the endless sentence. So now, centuries later, as tourists snap selfies in front of her empty monument, or scholars debate her intentions in university halls, or you and I sit here wondering what she really meant, we're all part of her plan. We're keeping the conversation alive. We're writing the next paragraph. And just maybe, that's what she wanted all along. Picture her now, not in marble or ink, not as a portrait or villainess in some dusty chronicle, but as a woman standing alone at the top of her life's mountain. The dynasty she founded already beginning to fade, her body aging, her mind still sharp, perhaps even sharper than before. Her enemies were circling, her sons uneasy, her court in quiet revolt. But Wu Zetian, she had already written the final twist. Not with words, with absence. It's tempting to think of her last years as a fall from grace, and in some ways they were. She grew increasingly dependent on two young men, the Zhang brothers, handsome, smooth-talking flatterers, who, let's just say, were very close to her. Court officials loathed them. Rumors swirled. Whispers turned to formal petitions. Eventually, even her most loyal allies began pulling away. By 705, the court had had enough. A coup was staged. It was clean, quiet, swift. Wu Zetian, nearly blind and bedridden, was forced to abdicate. She died shortly after, stripped of her Zhou dynasty name, folded back into Tang history like a footnote. The official records would say she was buried as Empress consort, not emperor. Just another woman behind the curtain. But the blank stele tells a different story. Because for all the attempts to erase, reduce, or contain her legacy, no one could quite do it. The stele remained, the tomb remained, the mountain remained. And more importantly, the idea of Wu Zetian remained too big, too strange, too brilliant to disappear into a line of dynastic timelines. So why didn't she fight harder to preserve her story in her own words? Why didn't she leave behind an autobiography or a collection of edicts or some final declaration? Maybe she didn't need to. Maybe she knew that writing her own version would only invite it to be destroyed. Maybe she trusted the sheer audacity of her life to outlive any single narrative. Or maybe, just maybe, she realized the most powerful ending wasn't a speech, but an ellipsis. Because if she had tried to summarize her legacy in stone, it would have locked her in one frame. But with a blank stele, she became infinite. Every scholar, every storyteller, every person passing by Channing becomes part of her legacy simply by wondering about her. And this is what makes Wu Zetian different from every other ruler in Chinese history. They built their image for the now. She built hers for forever. No slogan, no inscription, just a question. 1,000 years later, it still works. We still lean in closer, squinting at that silent slab, trying to decipher meaning in the absence of meaning. Trying to understand a ruler who did the unthinkable, not just by taking the throne, but by knowing when to stop speaking. That is her final power move. Not the rise, not the reign, but the refusal to explain. So maybe that's what the blank stele really is. Not an omission, but a revolution. A challenge hurled through time, daring us to stop reducing people, especially women in power, to one simple narrative. Daring us to admit that some lives are too big for one story, too strange for one sentence, too real for one stone. And as you lie there, drifting into the quiet that she herself once chose, remember this. The most powerful emperors build walls, armies, laws. But Wu Zetian, she built a question so enduring, so elegant, that we're still answering it 12 centuries later. And we haven't even scratched the surface. So now, the story draws to a close. The mountain grows quiet again. The air around Qianling stills. And that silent stele still stands. You've journeyed through centuries tonight, walked beside emperors and whispers, through courts and shadows, through fire and silence. And somewhere in the folds of that history, maybe you caught a glimpse not just of Wu Zetian, but of the mystery she left behind for us to hold. There's no need to solve it now. Let it rest. Let it breathe. Let that blank space be exactly what it is. A pause, not a conclusion. Take a slow breath in. And as you exhale, imagine the stars above her tomb glowing just a little softer, the mountain watching over her with the quiet patience of time. The world moving on, but her presence still folded gently into the fabric of it all. You don't need to remember every date or name, just the feeling. The feeling that some stories are too wide for ages, that silence can speak, that power can be redefined, and that even after 1,000 years, a woman who refused to be written off is still being written about. Now close your eyes. You're already drifting,